Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to introduce Lia Domke. Lia is a 2023 Alaska Sea Grant State Fellow with the NOAA Alaska Regional Office Habitat Conservation Division, and she supports advancing our understanding of essential nearshore fish habitats. Lia is completing her PhD in December 2023 at the University of Alaska Fairbanks College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, and her PhD focuses on nearshore fish communities and their associated habitats. Lia, take it away.
Thanks, Shannon. I will be talking about a portion of my research related to my dissertation that I recently defended at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And so I'll be talking about the role of apex predators, habitat, and seascape complexity on nearshore fish assemblages in Southeast Alaska. I live and work on the traditional lands of the Occoquan, but the research I'm presenting on today took place on the traditional lands of the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. And these lands have been and continue to be stewarded and shaped by Indigenous peoples. While my research uses Western approaches to understand patterns in the nearshore, this approach can be limited, especially compared to the thousands of years of place-based knowledge held by Indigenous peoples. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge support from these organizations. Much of the research and personnel support came from NSF and BLAST, with administrative support from CFOS, UIF, UIS, and additional support from AFS, Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, and Earthwatch to support bringing personnel out into the field. So this is a quick overview about what I will be talking about today, and hopefully by the end you'll understand why it's important to consider the nearshore when we're thinking about fisheries management. So first I'm going to talk about the importance of the nearshore, some of the different structuring forces in the nearshore, and how and what influences the coastal community. And then from my dissertation, I have two vignettes that I'll be talking about, the influence of apex predator, as well as the influence of habitat heterogeneity on nearshore fish communities. And then finally, I'll touch on some of the implications of this work. So to get us on the same page, in this seminar, I'm going to be talking about the nearshore ecosystem. And in Southeast Alaska and in this research, when I'm thinking about the nearshore, I'm thinking about generally shallow areas, less than 6 meters deep, and light is penetrating through the water, which allows for growth of vegetation, which can include understory kelps, canopy forming kelps, seagrasses, which are marine vascular plants. But these areas can also have rocky bedrock outcroppings, ramps of sand, gravel, and little pocket beaches as well. So it's a pretty dynamic area. And the nearshore is important both to humans and for organisms in the marine realm for helping reduce coastal erosion. It can play a role in carbon sequestration. It can enhance larval settlement. And importantly for the talk today, it can provide nursery and spawning habitat for ecologically and commercially important fish. And so when I am talking about ecologically and commercial fish, these are some of the characters I'm talking about. And these are species that spend a portion of their life history in the nearshore. And Alaska represents about 60% of the commercial landings in the United States. And we find a lot of those species in the nearshore. So we have juvenile salmon, juvenile cods, juvenile lingcod, which are an important recreational fishery. Juvenile rockfishes recruit to the nearshore in late fall. And we have some non-fish species as well that are important, including juvenile Dungeness. We've seen juvenile spot prawns in our beach seines, sea cucumbers, and in rockier habitats, we see sea urchins. We also see a lot of forage fishes, and these guys can be present in the nearshore. They can connect nearshore, like they move inshore, offshore, and they can connect the nearshore to terrestrial and pelagic ecosystems. And they have a special role as ecologically as they're located towards the base of the food web, and they support a lot of other species, including marine mammals, larger fishes, birds. And if we think about the structuring forces in the nearshore has immense variability, and it's the interface between the land and the sea. and it has lots of variability across space and time, and it's some pretty complex and dynamic food webs. As this diagram from Coletti et al. 2016 shows, there's lots of movement of nutrients and influx of nutrients from the terrestrial realms, but also from oceanic realms. And this nearshore area and the organisms in that rely on that area can tie together seemingly disparate ecosystems, such as temperate rainforests, glaciers, and the nearshore can play a really important role as it generates quite a lot of primary productivity. And lots of species are reliant on that primary productivity, including invertebrates, birds, fishes, and marine mammals as well. In addition to having dynamic and complex food webs, apex predators is another such structuring force that can alter nearshore food webs. So in this simplistic food web that I've included on the left here, we have top predators that are consuming intermediate predators that then eat marine epifauna, which are grazing on epiphytic algae. And the algae can outcompete eelgrass for light and nutrients. And so when we have changes in the abundance of the top predator or apex predator, that can have cascading impacts on the different parts of the ecosystem. And this is what we call a trophic cascade. And so in this way, apex predators disproportionately impact the ecosystems they occupy. An example of this can come from Elkhorn Slough in California, where sea otters are consuming the intermediate predators, crabs, which then consume sea hares, which are grazing on the algal epiphytes on eelgrass. And so because of this trophic cascade, with an increase in sea otters, that leads to an indirect impact on the eelgrass at the base of that food web. So in this way, these apex predators indirectly impact a lot of these habitats. And this isn't the only example of sea otters altering nearshore ecosystems. The classic example comes from canopy kelp forests, where when we have sea otters present on the left-hand side, we have these expansive canopy forming kelp forests. And then when the sea otters are absent, the urchins overgraze the canopy kelp and can reduce the extent of the canopy kelp forest. So we're seeing that sea otters are altering nearshore ecosystems, both in canopy kelp forests, but also in soft sediment areas and seagrass meadows. And this habitat alteration can have indirect impacts or effects on other species. So continuing with this example of sea otters in canopy kelp forests, we've seen that when the sea otters are present, there's a higher abundance of fish, as indicated by the blue bar graph on the left. And when they're absent, there's reduced fish abundance. The indirect impacts of sea otters can also cause other species to alter their diet, with the graph on the right showing that gulls primarily consumed fish when sea otters were present, and then when sea otters are absent, they're primarily consuming invertebrates. And so because sea otters can cause this change in the habitat and then also in the foraging dynamics of certain fish, it can also change the trophic level at which the fish are foraging. So this figure here, there's a lot going on, but what I want you to pay attention to is the solid line here. So that's the trophic level of the adult rockfish. And so they're foraging at a lower trophic level when otters are absent. And then when otters are present, as exemplified by the dotted line here, the foraging trophic level of that rockfish goes up. So sea otters, through their habitat alterations, are indirectly impacting nearshore fish communities in these examples here. And in Southeast Alaska, we have a lot of coastline and a lot of nearshore habitats that sea otters potentially could be impacting or altering. So for those that may not be familiar with Southeast Alaska, it's located on the panhandle of Alaska, close to British Columbia, and it's a vast area. We have approximately 30,000 kilometers of coastline, which is more than double the coastline of Washington, Oregon, and California combined. And this coastline has lots of vegetation with canopy kelps, eelgrass, and understory kelps. And that looks like this, where we have some examples of eelgrass on the left here, understory kelps on the right, and then canopy kelps right at the top here. So if we think about the fact that sea otters are impacting nearshore habitats, for us in Southeast Alaska, we were curious if it's also impacting the fish community. So this leads me to my first vignette and the objective of the first vignette, which was to determine whether fish community composition and diversity changed with sea otter presence and time in both understory kelp habitats on the left and eelgrass meadows on the right. So to understand how we went about doing that, you have to understand that sea otters have historically existed throughout the Pacific Rim, as indicated by the yellow here. But in the 18th century fur trade, they were completely extirpated in Southeast Alaska and reduced in certain parts of their ranges. In the 1960s, sea otters were reintroduced into Southeast Alaska, and since then their population has been expanding. The current population is indicated by the purple here, approximately. But in Southeast Alaska, as the population expands, they recolonize certain areas of Southeast Alaska. And we can take advantage of this shifting pattern of abundance to ask really interesting questions about the impact of sea otters in the near shore. So to look at changes in fish community composition and diversity with sea otter presence and time, and to disentangle the effect of sea otter presence and time, we used a paired before-after controlled impact, or BACI analysis, where we have nearshore sayings of fish communities that occurred in the 1990s to early 2000s before sea otters had moved into certain areas. And then we also have sayings that we went out and redid in 2019 and 2021 of those same exact sites. And at a subset of those sites, sea otters are now present, and at a subsite, sea otters remain absent. And that expansion of sea otters over time is represented here in these maps, where we have the historical sayings on the left-hand side, and you can see where those sayings occurred, the sea otters were still absent. And then on the right-hand side, when we resampled those areas contemporarily in 2019 and 2021, we have sea otters present at a subset of the sites, but not all of the sites. So to understand how we were sampling these nearshore fish communities, we used beach seining. And so we replicated the same methods that were used in the 1990s in 2019 and 2021. And because I'm using beach seining for both of the questions that I'm presenting on today, I wanted to show you a quick video of what that looks like. So it might be a little bit choppy, but basically we have someone wade about waist deep into the water. We throw them one end of the net, and then as we back the boat away, we create this U-shaped haul with the boat as we're putting the net out. And this is a 37-meter long variable mesh net, so it's quite big and it's very heavy. And so we have to use a boat to set this. We get the other end of the U-shaped haul on shore, and then we pull the net through the habitat of interest. In this case, this video is showing us seining in eelgrass. So we use the beach seine to quantify fish community diversity and abundance in these nearshore ecosystems. So to ask our questions about changes with sea otters and while accounting for changes across time, we used two different approaches: a univariate approach, where we looked at fish species richness, basically the number of species present in the nearshore, and then also changes to fish species diversity using the Shannon Index, which considers both the number of species and its evenness. And then we also used a multivariate approach to look at changes in species composition. For the first univariate part, I created conceptual models of what we might expect to see depending on whether there was no effect of sea otters, an effect of time, or effect of just sea otters. So if there's no effect, we would expect basically no change in richness or diversity from before to after, regardless of whether or not the sites were sea otters were absent or where they were present in purple. If there's an effect of time, we would expect an increase or decrease of richness and diversity, regardless of if sea otters were absent or present. And if there's an effect of sea otters, we would expect to see this interaction effect of where the sea otters are absent. We wouldn't expect much of a change from before to after, but we would expect either an increase or decrease in diversity where sea otters were present. And we can evaluate these effects using a two-way ANOVA that incorporates time, sea otter presence, its interaction, and includes a random effect because we're resampling the same sites across time. So looking at the results, we found a significant increase in species richness in understory kelp communities across time. And so the average here is represented by the bolded lines that in both purple and gray that increase across time. And the faded thin lines in the background are showing an individual site's change across time. We found a significant increase of fish species richness in eelgrass meadows only after sea otters recolonize. So we're seeing that characteristic interaction effect where there isn't much change in the richness where sea otters are absent, but we see an increase where the sea otters are present. For diversity, we didn't see any patterns in the diversity index in either understory kelp beds nor in eelgrass meadows, which is really interesting and makes us ask which species are different and why are we seeing changes in richness but not diversity. So overall, we had 22 additional species that we found across all of the seines. And there was lots of new species present, but they were present only in really low numbers. And that included small sculpins, a couple species of flatfishes, some greenlings, as well as some juvenile rockfishes. So thinking about our multivariate approach, I again created conceptual models of what we may expect to see, but this time we're using a multivariate measure to understand the fish community. And so basically we're creating this like cloud of multidimensional data of fish abundances at a single site. But since we can't visualize 40 dimensions, we reduce the dimensionality to just 2 to visualize it on a conventional graph using non-metric multidimensional scaling, which is what I'll present here. And then we can look at changes in approximate locations using those graphs. So here's what we would expect to see if there was no effect of time or sea otters. These ellipses here represent the 95% confidence region of the data. And if there's no effect, we wouldn't expect a shift in the location of these ellipses. If there's an effect of time, we would expect to see from before the dashed line to after a shift in the location of both ellipses, regardless of whether sea otters were absent or present. And again, if there's an effect of sea otters, we would expect the sites where sea otters are absent to remain relatively the same location, and then the shift of the ellipses where sea otters are present from before to after. And we can evaluate this change using a permutation-based ANOVA or PermANOVA that incorporates time, sea otter presence, its interaction, and includes blocks for the random effect, because again, we're resampling the same site across time. So we found a significant difference between areas with reintroduced sea otters for the understory kelp fish community. So each point on this graph here represents a single site and the composition of species present at that site. And the relative location is what matters. So there's clustering of circular points together and square points together by color as well. And the ellipses represent the 95% confidence region of that. And what we're seeing here is there's a shift primarily in the purple ellipses from before, which is the dashed line, with a shift up after sea otters recolonized, as indicated by that arrow there. And that shift in fish community composition is driven by a couple species, including rockfishes, juvenile greenlings, and small sculpins. And we can actually look at which species are significantly contributing to the difference in the understory community after sea otters recolonized. which is what we did, and found that the species at the top part of the plot explain about 24% of the variation, and all of those species saw declines after sea otters recolonized. And then about 5% of the variation was explained by species that actually increased after sea otters recolonized, which included juvenile rockfish, Artidius sculpins, and rock greenlings. Interestingly, we didn't see this pattern in eelgrass meadows. Okay, to summarize this vignette, we found increased species richness in eelgrass meadows after sea otter recolonization. And changes in the species richness could be related to changes in prey quality or type, especially if the habitat itself is changing. Does that change the prey species that are available? It could, the habitat, if it's being changed, could be better for refuge, or there could be changes to the niche diversity, and certain species may benefit while other species may be absent, which is something that we saw. Most likely, the changes that we saw in richness are probably a collective result of all of these impacts. And just as a reminder, like, these habitats do matter, because especially at the edges, these areas can be areas of intense predation. And you might not be able to see it in this photo because of the camouflage, but if we zoom in, we're seeing a great sculpin consuming a staghorn sculpin here. So we've got the great sculpin on the right and a staghorn on the left. In understory kelp communities, we saw a shift in fish species composition. And this is consistent with other studies that have looked at the indirect effects of sea otters on nearshore fish communities. In other studies, they've seen increased juvenile rockfish and increased trophic levels of adult rockfishes. And in another study in the Aleutian chain, they saw increased rock greenlings with abundant sea otter populations, which is consistent with what we saw in this work. Overall, this work reinforces the role of sea otters as an important structuring force in nearshore ecosystems, in particular for fish communities. So up until this point, I've been talking about submerged vegetation in Southeast Alaska as discrete habitats, either eelgrass or understory kelp. But in reality, this is what the coastline in the nearshore area looks like in Southeast Alaska. So I have one of our research technicians here circled in white as an idea of scale, but this area is has mosaics of nearshore habitats in close proximity to one another. And you can see that here where we've outlined the eelgrass meadows in green. We also have that directly adjacent to understory kelp in orange, and then also canopy forming kelp over here in brown. And there's connectivity and movement amongst these co-occurring habitats. And this can be really important. And so this seascape, understanding the nearshore habitats as a seascape that has connectivity, that is influenced by both the habitat configuration and the composition of the habitats in the nearshore. And this connectivity across the seascape can ameliorate the function of a certain habitat. In this case, it's outlining this diagram from Olson et al. 2019 is outlining how the nursery effect of eelgrass meadows is improved by being directly adjacent to a canopy forming kelp, where these rockfish had improved body condition because they were seeking refuge in the eelgrass and then foraging in the canopy kelp. So to get at this idea, I wanted to ask, within eelgrass meadows, does the fish community and diversity change as we increase our seascape complexity, as we move from large expansive single habitats to more complex habitats with more complex seascape with multiple habitats? So I went out and looked for certain types of habitats in the nearshore. So we identified homogeneous seascapes, which are composed of eelgrass meadows with large expansive meadows that don't have adjacent habitats, and we beach seined in the eelgrass there, as indicated by the star. And then we also looked for heterogeneous seascapes, which are eelgrass that have adjacent kelp. And so this is the same image from before, but you see we're beach seining within the eelgrass, but what matters is that there's adjacent kelp nearby. And so just to be really clear, is all of the seines in this next vignette occurred in eelgrass meadows. Some had adjacent habitats and some did not. So we went out and identified homogeneous and heterogeneous seascapes in similar wave exposure areas, and then beach seined in eelgrass. Then identified small-scale kelp and eelgrass biomass. So in homogeneous seascapes, we're just measuring small-scale eelgrass, but in heterogeneous seascapes, we're measuring both the kelp and the eelgrass biomass. Then we used unoccupied aerial systems, or drones, to calculate seascape level parameters, which include eelgrass patch size, area to edge ratio, habitat richness, and the number of structured habitat patches present, as well as the proportion of each habitat type. And this is what our drone system looks like in Southeast Alaska. And we use that drone to take between 200 to 300 images of the areas where we are sampling. This is what an orthomosaic of one of our sites looks like. So we take those 200 to 300 images, we create an orthomosaic, and then we went through by hand and identified habitat polygons of each of the different habitat types present. And then we were able from that to calculate spatial arrangement and composition metrics for each site. So the image processing looks a lot like this, where we have an image on the left here before we've identified the different habitats. And then on the right, we identify the land because fish don't live on land. And then we identified the different nearshore habitats, including eelgrass in pink, understory kelps in blue, canopy kelps in yellow, and identified all of the ones that were present. And we did this across 19 sites and then calculated the seascape metrics and the small scale habitat metrics for each one of those sites. And so this work happened in southern Southeast Alaska again on Prince of Wales Island. And just to remind you, and just to remind everyone the sense of scale we're talking about, these sites span more than 100 kilometers in distance. So this is a large area. We found greater fish richness and diversity in heterogeneous seascapes compared to homogeneous seascapes, as indicated by the box plots here, where the yellow indicates the heterogeneous seascapes and the green, the homogeneous seascapes. We found no difference between homogeneous and heterogeneous seascapes for total fish abundance, total fish biomass, or evenness. We also identified shifts in the fish community composition. And again, I'm presenting a non-metric multidimensional scaling plot of our multidimensional data represented in 2 dimensions. And again, each one of these points here represents a single site and the species composition at that site, with the color indicating whether it's a heterogeneous seascape, yellow, or homogeneous seascape, green. And you'll notice that there's clustering of the yellow sites on the right-hand side of this plot and the green sites, or the homogeneous seascapes, on the left-hand side of this plot. And again, the ellipses represents the 95% confidence region of this multivariate space. And we can look at which species are driving the differences between the heterogeneous and homogeneous seascapes. And there's a lot of species on here, but there's a couple that come out with longer, with being more strongly associated with habitats, including lingcod, more associated with heterogeneous seascapes, as well as copper quillback juvenile rockfish complex, and Pacific staghorn sculpin and snake prickleback, more associated with these homogeneous seascapes. And we can look at the changes in abundance by the top 10 species significantly contributing to the difference between these 2 communities. So we found increased abundance of these top 3 species here in homogeneous seascapes. So we're seeing greater abundance of 3-spined sticklebacks, shiner perch, and Pacific staghorn sculpins in homogeneous seascapes, with the rest of the species contributing to the difference between the 2 communities being in greater abundance in the heterogeneous seascapes. So that includes juvenile lingcod, white-spotted greenlings, juvenile artidius, silver-spotted sculpins, Pacific sand lance, copper rockfish, and pink salmon. And all of those were increased abundance in the heterogeneous seascapes. We also looked at the size distribution shifts between the two seascape types and basically found that for these two species here, the three-spined stickleback and the shiner perch, there were greater abundance of smaller individuals, but only in the homogeneous seascapes that had the expansive eelgrass meadows, whereas we weren't seeing that shift in the other species that we looked at. And this indicates that these species are reproducing in these habitats, demonstrating that the homogeneous seascape could be an important reproductive habitat for these species. All right, to bring this together, we found greater species richness and diversity in heterogeneous seascapes. And we also saw a shift in fish community composition between heterogeneous and homogeneous seascapes. And to look at some of the noteworthy species that we saw a greater abundance of juvenile lingcod in heterogeneous seascapes, as well as a greater abundance of juvenile rockfish. And what's interesting about this is that in our other work, not presented here, we were sampling other eelgrass meadows in the same region, and we didn't start catching juvenile lingcod in large abundances until we started sampling these heterogeneous seascapes, indicating that these adjacent habitats are likely conferring an additional benefit to juvenile lingcod and juvenile rockfish. And this has been seen for juvenile rockfish before, where these adjacent habitats are a nutritional subsidy for juvenile rockfish, with improved body condition for juvenile rockfish present in eelgrass that is adjacent to canopy kelp, and also in other work that has seen habitat subsidies of epiphytic algae from eelgrass and bull kelp being present in juvenile rockfish diets, regardless of whether the juvenile rockfish were caught in eelgrass or canopy-forming kelp forests. We also saw a greater abundance of schooling juveniles in homogeneous seascapes, which is consistent with other studies that have seen that noted that reduced habitat heterogeneity or more homogeneous seascapes were associated with three-spined sticklebacks. So bringing all of this work together and stepping back and thinking about what these vignettes mean for nearshore habitats. Clearly, the nearshore supports fish, and it can host tremendous biodiversity. But at the same time, these areas have high environmental variability, and the fact that we are able to disentangle any patterns speak to the strength of some of the interactions that we investigated. In terms of the indirect effect of sea otters, we noted that sea otters are a strong structuring force in the nearshore. And the full scope of the effects of sea otters, their recolonization and population growth within Southeast Alaska is a source of ongoing research. And this dissertation in particular highlights that these indirect effects can be seen in Southeast Alaska, in addition to other areas where they've been documented, including the Aleutian Chain, California, and BC. And as a strong structuring role, this leads to an ever-evolving but complex management scenario, since a lot of these different aspects of the nearshore ecosystem are managed by different entities. And often these management entities and the management approach has these different aspects siloed, which emphasizes the importance of continuing to work on incorporating ecosystem-based management in these areas. Further, I hope that this work helps you transition how you think about these individual habitats as well. Historically in the literature and previously, eelgrass has been studied as a habitat surrounded by non-habitat, and that there are species that rely on it or don't. But in reality, these habitats can be co-occurring, and it's a little bit more complex than that. So likely, synergistically, seascape complexity and apex predators together are likely modulating the nearshore fish community in concert with other biotic and abiotic factors. And this is particularly important when these habitat patches are co-occurring or occurring adjacent to one another, like we're seeing in this photo here on the right. And this can be important because this influences how we manage the nearshore. And and how we evaluate our trade-offs when it comes to management and conservation decisions, and highlights the need to incorporate the complexity of the nearshore seascape and connectivity with how we talk about our nearshore communities. So I wanted to leave off with this idea here, which is a photo of one of the first sites that we sampled when I wanted to ask these questions about seascape complexity. And as you're seeing in the photo here, we have eelgrass meadows directly adjacent to macrocystis, directly adjacent to understory kelps here. And when I first wanted to sample this, I was worried I wouldn't be able to find sites that had these habitats in close proximity. But in reality, when I started looking for it, these habitats were more common as soon as I started going out and looking. So this work helps us understand how nearshore habitats support our fisheries populations, and it adds to the ongoing effort to better incorporate our understanding of nearshore ecosystems into management and policy. Further work of these fish communities in the nearshore may benefit, in particular in Southeast Alaska, from including other aspects like other aspects of the food web like diet, prey availability, and continue to elucidate these trophic connections across these formerly discrete habitats. I want to show some of the faces of some of the people that helped do this work. It's the result of 5 field seasons, and so many technicians and graduate students helped support collecting this data. This would not be possible without them. And I am happy to take any questions.
So the first question we have, Lia, is do you have excuse me, do you have any thoughts on how kelp aquaculture might affect the dynamics of your findings?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's something a lot of us want to have a better understanding of. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about kelp aquaculture is that it's creating these kind of canopy-like kelp forests. It's not the same, but it's similar in areas where they previously weren't. And so it can provide habitat potentially in an area where there wasn't habitat before. One of the additional complexities is that we're taking it out of the water, often before they start getting fouled, and it's before the peak reproductive time for some of these fish, which is like it's July. All of that to say is that I don't quite know. It could, and I think that this is, I think a lot of people in Alaska want to know that and are working on this question. And one of the things that I hope comes out of the work that's ongoing in Alaska about the role of kelp aquaculture is that they'll incorporate this idea of seascape complexity, that the influence of kelp aquaculture in a single location won't be isolated to that single location, that there could be, to borrow a term from MPA literature, there could be spillover effects in other aspects of the nearshore. So it's not a direct answer to that question, but I look forward to the research that's coming out of Alaska to get at that better. But thanks for the question.
Thank you so much. All right, our next question here says, great presentation, that's a lot of work. For the fish species that you saw changes in, were they targeted in fisheries? And if so, is there fishing pressure data available over the time period that was sampled?
Yeah, so a lot of these fish species that I was talking about are primarily juveniles. So they're not actively a part of a fishery yet. So the fishery pressure, maybe if there was an effective fishing pressure, it would be lagged probably a couple of years as like influencing reproduction and productivity and all of that. There's recreational fisheries in this area, but I guess the other point that I probably didn't highlight, Prince of Wales is a pretty sparsely populated area. And while there's intense recreational fisheries in the summertime, often for salmon, there's, and often commercial fisheries too for salmon, there's just not that as many people impacting that area compared to like other commercial fisheries in other parts of the United States. So I think that is something that we could incorporate. I would have to think more deeply about the effect that we might see from fishing pressure data, I guess. But it's also a great thing to bring up. So thanks for asking that.
Great, thank you. We have some kudos coming in for you, and we will definitely share those with you afterwards. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'll just follow up with one last question. So if anyone has any lingering thoughts, make sure to type it in now. Lia, a huge congratulations on finishing up your PhD. So my question is, what is next for you? Are you going to continue this research, or do you have something else in mind?
Yeah, I'm currently working on getting all of this research published, and I'm currently, in a year-long fellowship position with the Alaska Sea Grant State Fellow Program, and I'm working in the Habitat Conservation Division. And so I'm working with a couple collaborators here to work on how we talk about essential fish habitat. And right now that's done primarily offshore and not necessarily incorporating nearshore productivity and nearshore fish communities in part when we identify where essential fish habitat is. So we're working on incorporating the nearshore into our essential fish habitat, which is really exciting and I think a great next step, and hopefully also incorporating some of these Seascape metrics into how we talk about essential fish habitat.
Awesome, thanks so much. All right, we got one last question while you're talking. Did you do any observations on Prince William Sound? This is coming from someone who was there for the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989.
That must have been quite a time to be there. So I resampled sites that were sampled in the 90s as a part of the Nearshore Fish Atlas. And so the Nearshore Fish Atlas does include sites in Prince William Sound, but it wasn't something that I looked at in this work. But I think that there's a lot of work that people have been doing associated with the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council as well as Gulf Watch, looking at those impacts of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. As far as I know, I don't believe there were impacts that were seen during the time that the beach stains were occurring in southern Southeast Alaska in the late 90s. I would have to talk to a couple more people to be positive about that, but as far as I could tell from the metadata, they didn't list anything like that. But thanks for that question.